Hello and welcome to College of Idaho Insights. I'm Dustin Wunderlich, and today we'll be discussing issues involving migration. I'm joined today by Dr. Lisa Meierotto, Professor of Anthropology and Sociology, Dr. Regan Postma, Professor of Spanish, and Dr. Megan Dixon, Professor of Environmental Studies and Geography. To start off with, Lisa, you recently wrote an article about environmental impacts of undocumented immigration in Arizona and also the impact of Border Patrol agents. Could you talk a little bit about the main findings of the research that you did?
Yeah, so one of the main areas of study in terms of looking at migration is what impact migration has on the environment. And so between 2007 and 2009, I did field work down on the US-Mexico border, and I was really trying to explore that issue of what is the environmental degradation that is caused by undocumented immigration. And I was really drawn to the idea when I first went to Arizona. And I noticed that every night on the news, on the local news, there were stories about the undocumented immigrants leaving garbage and leaving plastic bottles and creating this like horrible garbage dump on the border. And so it was sort of portrayed as this huge environmental problem on the border. And I was curious about that and kind of how that perception of garbage on the border and garbage destroying the border came about. So when I went down to do field work, and started talking with people who live in southern Arizona and who live near some of these wilderness protected areas, what I found out is that there was a second process of environmental damage happening from migration, and that was the response to migration, which is mostly Border Patrol and kind of broadly under Homeland Security. And so in the pursuit of catching undocumented immigrants as well as smugglers, Border Patrol kind of has free reign over a lot of these wilderness areas, and they have created a lot of illegal roads, and so driving off-road in a fragile desert environment has impacts on things like the soil and on the rain flow, runoff patterns, and as well as like it's just sort of disruptive to wildlife and the natural environment. And so it was kind of an interesting finding to expand the sort of the perceptions of what was actually causing the environmental harm to seeing these multi-sides of the issue and how environmental damage was coming from lots of different directions because of the patterns and policies of the way that immigration happens across the US-Mexico border.
Well, and Regan, you recently taught a course on the US-Mexico border and in contemporary narrative and film. Can you talk about a couple of the issues that you and your students discussed in that course?
Sure. Well, for the course, I really wanted to look at the US-Mexico border and migration through literature and film. And so the question was, how does this work understand the US-Mexico border and migration? And the students were kind of confused by that question at first. But we looked at it from the perspective of a variety of works. And a lot of different issues came up. I think, again, that migration, as people often think of migrants as middle-aged men or young men and people that are impoverished from Mexico. And the class kind of broke that stereotype because we looked at issues of social class in some of the literary works, gender, language, race, and kind of in the works, I think we saw not only movement from Mexico to the US, but also the return of people in recent years. And you know, people who, I was just thinking of one film in particular called El Infierno, or Hell, by Luis Estrada. And this man returns, he's deported from the US to Mexico, and he goes back and he's speaking English with his family. And the students thought that was so funny, but this person had lived in the United States for 15 years, and so, or around there. And so he goes back and he has, you know, these issues of language, of not being able to speak Spanish very well anymore. And his desires to create this language school are destroyed because because of the economy in Mexico. So I think students started to realize it's not only north to south, or south to north, but north to south. and that it's very complicated with all of these different issues. It's not just, there's not just one kind of migration.
And Megan, you've done some research on the experience of Chinese migrants in Russian cities and the interactions between Russians and Chinese. How did that interest you as a geographer in those sorts of issues?
Well, the issues we're discussing that are local here are interesting to me now because of this research I was doing on migration in St. Petersburg. And geographers look quite often at issues of location, not surprisingly. So where specifically are people coming from and where are they going to and why is that? I think one perception that often arises with migration, whatever country it's going to, among some people, is that an entire country or region is rising up and surging in some direction. So in Russia, the perception sometimes is that all of northern China is surging towards the Russian-Chinese border trying to get in. And it turns out, that as I found in my research, that in particular places where migrants live, they're part of what's called migration streams. So certain economic conditions arise in a certain place, people want to try their luck somewhere else, and they move, and they tend to then perpetuate often what's called chain migration, where someone arrives, gets to know the circumstances, and brings others along because there's some familiarity involved. So geographers are very interested in these migration streams, departure locations, arrival locations, the impacts in both places. And another major theme geographers look at is the border, as Regan already introduced. What is a border, and what does it feel like, both nearby and at a distance? One of the important themes right now looking at Chinese migration to Russia is perceptions of that migration near the border with China in the Russian Far East and from the large cities, say Moscow. So it looks much more alarming to some people in Moscow than it does to people who actually live along the paired cities along the Far Eastern border. It isn't to say there aren't various problems, but people who live near the border see it as a much more positive economic and social thing quite often than people who live in Moscow.
Now, you've all been looking at migration from a number of different disciplines. Why is migration so important to study now, especially as part of a liberal arts education, do you think?
Well, I mean, migration is a central part of the human experience. So in anthropology, and in lots of fields, but especially in anthropology, we look at the whole human experience. And so if we understand that migration is actually a natural part of human life, then it becomes more interesting. And I think all of us are looking at perceptions of migration, and a lot of times there are so many negative perceptions of migration, whether it's environmental or social, but the reality is for most people in most places it's more complicated than that and more nuanced, and there are positive repercussions and great stories of assimilation and multiculturalism and things that can also happen. So I think in some way it becomes a way to sort of challenge some of the more negative ideas about what we have about the movement of people. So.
I think from a literary and cultural studies perspective, it allows students to see that the border isn't just the border, but that there are many ways of understanding the border and any kind of experience. So some of the works understand migration as a pilgrimage, for example, and look back at indigenous migration within Mexico, from Mexico up into the U.S. Southwest, and so it's kind of a natural historical phenomena again. Or other ones understand it as quest or a journey to be with loved ones, and so it's not just seen in economic terms. And I think sometimes it's easy just to see this issue is this issue, but there are so many ways of understanding experience, and so and dealing with experience too. And so I think that's something that's really important for students to see.
Yeah, so many ways of telling the story.
Right, exactly.
And it kind of depends where you're sitting. I teach my writing course here at the college most of the time based around the theme of migration. And the first thing I ask students to do is to write the story of their own family's movement. And some students have lost this story in their family and they don't remember, or they have to call their grandparents and ask. But the general discovery everyone makes is we are all migrants. may go a few generations back for some people, but everybody's family has moved. And the sharing of that, I think, as Lisa pointed out, is really kind of an exciting thing. And when you look at it as your family searching for an opportunity, or for greater hope, or for surviving a disaster, like leaving a famine, or a war, or something like that, then students say, oh yeah, that's a really positive reason to migrate. You know, people should do that. And I'm glad my grandparents moved, or my great-grandparents, or whoever it happens to be. And I think that what Lisa pointed out, that it's really part of the human experience, makes it a really logical fit in the liberal arts. If we're trying to understand how we talk about the world, and what categories we should use to analyze it. Understanding that this movement is natural, I think, is really important in getting to maybe the more difficult conversations about what do we do about some of the things that are happening now as a consequence of migration, but that really, you know, you wouldn't want to stop it for all of the reasons that come up when you study it through narrative.
You can't stop it.
And you can't, right, you can't really stop it. People are always going to want to move on and seek new conditions.
It's kind of a nice way through the study of migration in different places and different times and seeing the history of migration. It can almost sort of defuse some of the political tensions that we have, so we get sort of stuck in ideas about who belongs where and when and what's the proper way to move about. And by having a broader perspective, it can help us sort of move out of these rigid ideas or rigid positions that people take on immigration, which all have valid components, but through the study of migration, it can really help us you know, have new perspectives and different angles and different ways of looking at migration. So
I would just add that too. I think studying migration, at least in the literature, was really interesting. I was worried that I needed to, you know, share all this historical context and political context with the students, but it came out in the literature. There were so many references to NAFTA in 1994, for example, and I think studying migration helps students to see how embedded politics and economics are in the process of migration. So I think I agree with you, but it also helps them to see how complicated it is. That people aren't just deciding to pick up and move, but that there are effects from treaties and agreements, for example, and multinational corporations going into other countries and things like that. So it's a lot more complicated.
yeah.
Are some of the forces of globalization and the world's economy becoming more global affecting migration and the reasons for migration, or have those forces always kind of been at play, do you think?
Well, I think to some extent they have always been in play, but there are certain aspects of globalization now that people study as having a very dramatic impact on people's experience maybe of moving. So if you look at the immigration to the US from Germany and Ireland, it was comparable proportionally at the time to the current recent Mexican migration to the US, which has slowed, as you probably will note. And so people have been moving in great numbers before. Something I think that's very interesting right now with globalization, and I point out to students in this type of conversation, is money can move very, very easily around the world. We have a wonderful banking system to shift money wherever it needs to go and be invested and all these things. It's much more difficult for people to move. And a lot of the people who are moving are working in many, many countries what we would classify as low-wage, underclass jobs. And so a great deal of pressure is being put on people who need work to move, which is difficult for them because of a renewed emphasis on borders after 9/11. And they need that to get the work, but they're put under a lot of stress. And so I think that's something that is good to become aware of, that when you're sitting in a very comfortable, for many people, country, and things go pretty well for you and you can manage your life day to day, I think it's just good perspective to realize the great difficulty many people go through just to get a dignified job and keep their families together. And it's not that that should make us feel guilty or do something, but we might maybe push for change in some of these policies that make that really respectable impulse into something very difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and an area for study. How do the bigger economic and global processes affect migration? And so on the U.S.-Mexico border, as you mentioned, we know that the flows of immigrants has slowed substantially since the economic recession in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a clear connection. And I think what will be more interesting, like we can see that connection, is to see how the economy, especially in the Southwest and in Arizona, will be able to rebuild with all of these stronger immigration laws in place. And so, you know, we can see what effect the economy has on immigration, but do we know what effect immigration has on the economy, right, in the opposite sense? And all of that is sort of, we're sort of living that experiment right now in the United States, and especially in the Southwest and in Arizona. So yeah, absolutely, their processes are very much connected. So.
Are there any issues involving migration going forward here in the coming decades that you're really interested in exploring, or things that you think will be kind of changing how immigration takes place?
Well, there's all the social and economic and political connections, but also just in a very tangible way. I'm really interested in the building of fences and walls and things on the U.S.-Mexico border. There are plans in place. They're not currently happening right now, but there are plans to continue the building of the fence and walls across the border. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that and see what sort of environmental and social impacts that has. And another interesting thing to look at in the future is that not a lot of people know this, but Greece is actually in the process of building a fence between Greece and Turkey, sort of modeled after the U.S.-Mexico border fence, because the European Union experiences similar challenges with integrating large numbers of immigrants into society. And so, so I think this, where we're going to build fences and how we'll build them and how we'll integrate military technology and all that, is going to be really fascinating in the next few years. So.
Well, I'm interested in kind of how people are dealing with these fences. So, you know, given that there are fences, how are people, you know, dealing with their experience with borders? Maybe not necessarily physically, physical borders, but you know, being emotionally separated from family. And then also, I think now there isn't as much flow of migration in this in recent years. But I think we have a lot of, you know, undocumented people living in the United States and in this area, and I'm really interested in, you know, how is our society going to deal with this as we get, especially many children who were born in the U.S. or born in, you know, another country to undocumented parents who came to the U.S. and are now, you know, college students and entering the workforce and highly educated. So I think I'm interested in some of those social issues in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think going along with this, I'm interested in how we define what it means to belong, right, in a way. I mean, I think what we've been saying about the study of migration and how much it is a part of everyone's experience, at least somewhere in the past, if not also the present, makes the issue of saying that's not about me is kind of complicated. And I think if you look back at the history of our own continent and look at who lived where, right, not that long ago in the past, and what these areas were called, and where the border was until fairly recently, it's really not much more than 150 years ago that parts of what we call Texas now were part of what was called Mexico, right, or was settled by the Spanish. And this shift of lines that sometimes leaves people behind on one side or the other, right, doesn't change how they feel about themselves, but it changes the box that they're put inside. And I think a lot of research on migration shows that a great deal of creativity and innovation and economic prosperity comes from a healthy immigration. This has been found to be true across the world in lots of different places. So people certainly see the problems, but it's important to emphasize the benefits, I think. And that in a post 9/11 world where people are very fearful of things that are different is a really important question to keep returning to. How are we going to find a way to talk to each other and cooperate, right, and integrate, as Lisa suggested, because we do need each other, I think, and the United States needs people to come here and develop its economy. Economists say that all the time. Under what circumstances maybe is the next question, but that needs to happen, and we need to keep having that conversation.
Well, thank you everybody for participating in today's conversation, and thank you to all of our viewers. Have a good day.
Thank you.